Good evening and welcome to Inside the Rookery, Season 6, Episode 4. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Today we are gathered to talk about COVID and home gaming, how COVID still impacts the games we play. Whether we caught it or not, COVID hit us hard as lockdowns and social distancing meant that face-to-face gaming ground to a halt. And we are here today to talk about what impact that had and what it still has. I am joined by four regular panelists: Mark Gibbons, Andy Leask, Andy Law, and James Wallace. Welcome back to the stream, James. This is your first appearance in season 6, I think.
Quite possibly, yes. It's
Yes.
mostly due to the Wi-Fi in my shed being rubbish.
It is indeed. Well, you're very welcome back to join us for season 6, and
It's good
we
to be
have got
here.
loads of questions and comments today, but as regular viewers will know, there's a limited amount of space in the StreamYard banner for those questions. So because a lot of them were more like stories, I've kept them in the Discord server and I will just read them out. But as always, I will bring them up on the screen if you are saying anything in the comments. You're all very tiny on my screen. We are.
Is that because there's 5 of us, or do we need to move closer to the camera? How was that?
It's because there's 5 of us, Mark. So actually, it's probably for the best that I'm not bringing up the banners because that makes us even smaller. So I will jump in to the questions that I have here. It's going to be different for the Rooks than usual. They're going to have to both listen to me and remember the questions. Good luck.
Oh no!
That's a tall order, Lindsay.
I'm
not
good at either of those things.
So here we go. Seagoat says, COVID is one of the many things that impacts gaming, but has been the most prevalent in recent years. What coping mechanisms do you have for loss of players, loss of venues, loss of GMs? Is it a simple case of reconvening, or do you have to do a hard restart and try again?
As always, I'm happy to jump in first. I just can't help myself. Bang! I'm here. Right. So we stopped entirely at this end. As many of you out there already know, I caught COVID in the very, very first wave before they even understood what COVID really was. It was before we were anywhere near lockdowns. It was long before anyone realized just how bad it was going to get. And I got it bad. It took me out for a good 6 months. And even after that, I could barely think or walk for a very long time. It was a tough time. So from our perspective, where beforehand we had a regular games night every single Sunday, we had various roleplay games going on and off, depending upon the, let's say, the season, we ground to a complete halt. And reestablishing things afterwards turned out to be, for us, an exercise in and of itself, because everybody had, to a degree, moved on. We had moved into a slightly different world where being online was, for many people, the established norm, where people who had not been able to find their local gaming groups had instead reached out online and possibly found people on the other side of the world, and they'd reestablished new social circles, and that was marvelous. But from the perspective of us restarting something and getting ourselves going again, it was just tough. We made a choice to go online because that brought a few advantages. The biggest one being we could actually reach out and say, we need to have some form of commitment that you're coming each week because we're intending to show this to everybody each week. And that, to a degree, brought us back to the mindset that we had beforehand, where everyone was turning up every week, everyone was being involved every week. And it opened up the door towards us reestablishing a link to our gaming, much as it was in the past, although in a slightly different environment. But for me, it was very much a restart. I imagine other people were in slightly different places, though. James looks like he's stuck over there, by the way. I thought so.
Oh, we've lost James. Yeah, I was waiting for James to talk.
I thought he just looked really thoughtful. And then
I know, yeah. Now we're bigger on the screen again. Yeah, I mean, obviously, Andy and I live in the same house, and Andy Leask is part of our regular gaming group. So, you know,
that answer covers.
My gaming group was a little less committed, I think, than yours pre-COVID. We only met regularly once a month, which was never really enough, I thought, to establish that frequency of commitment. But we went online during COVID, and we gamed with Tabletopia and Tabletop Simulator, which it meant we got to play a whole bunch of games that we perhaps nobody owned, that we perhaps wouldn't have picked up otherwise. And it added that random gameplay element of like this, your signal freezing, your dice rolls suddenly sort of going, you accidentally picking up more cards, dealing cards to players when you only meant to take one. So there's this kind of crazy element that sort of snuck into all your gaming sessions, which was sometimes hilarious, sometimes disastrous. But we've not kind of really sort of reconnected fully now that COVID is sort of still, in the background. But we've tried to get gaming groups together regularly again, and it's kind of like only sort of half of us turn up. So we've not managed to get things back on track yet.
Yeah, and for us, Mark, we would role play as often as we could, but that was at the perils of scheduling, which Seagoat mentions. But that Sunday gaming was like board gaming, and it was basically just like our house was open from 2:00. So every week, different people would come, different numbers of people would come. So we had our games with the 2 to 4 player games in one room, and and you would pick each week based on who came and what you fancied playing. And we've definitely lost that component of spontaneity in our lives, in our gaming. But also, I think, like, more broadly than in gaming, I would say lots of people do things less I can't even say that now. In a less spontaneous fashion than they did before COVID. Like, you arrange things more, because we all got into the habit of arranging set times and places to be online or to be at a place with your face mask and in the time slot that was accorded to you. And I think, in a way, like, we haven't, I certainly have not become as spontaneous as I was before COVID.
I mean, I think COVID's probably a factor of that. I think also, Lindsay, that is also perhaps just the factor of getting older and our lives getting busier as well. I think that also, like, you tend to be more spontaneous the younger you are.
No, not for me. For me, the reverse, because with having the kids, everything when your kids are little is arranged, right? So, like, because you're arranging around your kids' schedule. So you're going here and you're going there and you're fitting yourself in between. As COVID was coming, I was getting much more freedom from that because the kids were older. And so I was starting to do those things again. It's like, I feel like going ice skating this weekend. I'm going ice skating. Kids, do you want to come with me? Do you not want to come with me? So I think for me, it definitely has been the impact of COVID. Like being in the office with friends that, alongside me at work. And we'd be like, do you fancy going out tonight? Like, you never would do that. Everything would be prearranged now, because you'd need to know who was in the office on which days, etc. For those of us who work in that hybrid working model. Sassy Pancake says, ouch, that hits home. Is that the spontaneity, maybe?
I think so.
Yeah.
Just to double check, are you actually with us, James, or are you on a lovely freeze? Because it looks like you may be on a lovely freeze.
I think he's frozen again. I think the shed fire is the shed.
I'll actually say I think that's actually a perfect example of why I found online play so very difficult. It was not just the lack of connection that you get when you've got somebody in the room on the other side with you, but it was the vagaries of the internet connections, things possibly going wrong, real life impinging upon that time. Because often when you're meeting with others, that just doesn't occur. It's very rare that your games are interrupted by outside forces in comparison to when you're sitting at home and people just walk up to you and they sort of expect that you're not actually doing your gaming time because you're still in the house doing stuff. So they're happy to interrupt, and it meant that sessions as a whole were far more interrupted. Let's see if James comes in this time.
It's very rare that people freeze when they sat around the table with you.
Yeah.
Are you actually with us this time, James?
Or just go like in and out of the room repeatedly. Hi, I'm here.
Yeah.
You could recreate it quite amusingly. So I'm going to pick up while we wait to see if James is going to unfreeze. I'm going to.
I think I'm here.
Yay!
Oh, I hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
This
Excellent.
bloody thing.
So Eyeless Deceiver.
If anyone signed up with
says,
Community Fibre, sign off now. They're awful.
And sadly, that's the ones we have.
No, we've got Virgin.
Yeah.
He's talking about his provider, not his links.
Yeah.
Point taken.
So, Eyeless Deceiver says, the start of the pandemic here coincided with the start of my Wifrip game. As such, I asked the players if they wanted to play online, knowing several are not fans of online play. Lockdown being what it was, we moved online anyway, and we had a good 39 sessions that way. One of the players actually moved from the I will die on this tabletop camp to the other side and enjoys the freedom of playing from his own house. Question, did COVID make a lasting impact on your opinion of online play? Did it result in other changes to combining role-playing development and the online world for you? Andy, for one, started streaming, which if I recall, he said he thought he would not like, and that seems to have changed.
Yeah, I had no desire to do that at all to begin with. It was very much outside of my preferred wheelhouse, but needs must when the devil's ride.
Yeah, I was just going to say there was two things you didn't like before COVID. One was just playing games online, and one was streaming actual play. And I would say that you've come round to streaming actual play, at least I hope so, because we have converted our living room and spent a lot of money on audiovisual equipment. So if you don't like it, we're fucked. And
Watershed. Watershed.
We don't have one.
We're allowed to swear, James. Online playing, though, I don't think you ever came round to. It's not your preferred way of playing.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I tried hard and I found it a very difficult process because of, I think, just my own mindset and how I engage with material and how I engage with people. I work an awful lot off of body language, and if I can't see people, I will often just override and keep on talking because I find it difficult to stop talking sometimes. And without other people
sometimes.
Okay, I find it difficult to stop talking at all times. And I generally need some sort of audio-visual cue. People around me giving the obvious, oh, I've got something to say, for me to quickly finish off the thing I'm on and move on. I found it a lot more prone to soliloquies, a lot more prone to over-talking, a lot more prone to interruptions, a lot more difficult to keep the players equally engaged. I just, from the roleplay side, found it a far, far more staged and stagey and less conversational process. Everybody needed to have their moment of silence where everyone else shut up so you could hear that individual voice, which meant that the spontaneity of conversation loosely came to an end, and it became instead my character point. I step forward and say 1, 2, and 3 as the next character comes over and says, well, having said 2, I will say 5.
I think I don't know, Mark, you said you played like Tabletopia and stuff. Do you like the experience of board gaming virtually better or worse or different than in real life?
No, it's not. It's there's a kind of convenience to it. So I started my first experience with Tabletopia where I was helping a buddy in Nottingham play test some rules. So we couldn't have done that, across the 5,000 miles. So it was really handy and really useful. But there's so many variables that can mess up your game night. Other than your game night can get messed up face to face as well. But the perils of the technology and the limitations actually of what you can do comfortably in a virtual environment. I mean, there's certain games that are that much harder to play. If you've got to roll a lot of dice, that's tricky, the virtual stuff, because you've got to click on them and pick them up and roll them and gather them back around. Whereas in the real world, it's a lot more straightforward. It becomes an exercise in mouse dexterousness, which is kind of I guess that's an element of gameplay, but not when it's usually factored into the game design. So it's nice to be able to like dive in and try a new game without having to buy it, and you can probably get people to come around. Oh, do you want to play? They've just released this on Tabletopia. Should we have a go? And you can play it, and then if you like it enough, one person can go out and buy it, and then you can play it physically, and it's always better face to face. So as a sort of a opportunity to prototype a new game, introduce a new game to your group, it's really cool.
Yeah. I think for games designers, the Tabletopia type platforms are really interesting because what I observed when I can't remember which one I was using, but at the start of the pandemic when Andy was really ill, I kept on sort of playing online some board games with the gaming group, just when we could. And I found that you needed to understand the rules less because of all the automated stuff that the system does. Like, so whereas if you were learning Seven Wonders, like in real life, you would understand that everyone else is getting cards at the same time as you. If you were playing another game, you'd understand how many cards you were getting and why. But I found that like I didn't understand. So new games became quicker to pick up. The entry barrier to them was lower, but I couldn't quite understand like the strategy as much. I don't know if other people found that, and I thought from a design point of view that was quite interesting. Andy Liska's nodding.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think that ties into what Andy and I were talking about yesterday, an article that I read about the science behind why writing notes is more effective for remembering things than typing them. And that part of it is the physical thing that you're doing with your hand, and part of it is the geography of it on the page. Like if you've written it in the corner of a page, your brain remembers it's in the corner of a page, whereas it's on a scrolling screen, you don't have that same kind of spatial awareness. And I wondered if it was something similar in terms of, because you don't have the tactile element of the game and it all is a bit virtual. But then again, the other thing for me, and I know different people, like people's working experience through lockdowns were different, but as a teacher, like at the times when we were like teaching remotely, particularly because I was head of e-learning in the school at the time. So when I wasn't teaching, I was actively helping colleagues with how they could teach online, or I was making videos to show people how to do stuff. Like I was literally sit down on my computer screen like 8 o'clock in the morning, and that was me through to like 5:30, 8 and at night, like minimum. And then sometimes we would go online in the evening to try and play a game, and just after like half an hour, I'm like, my eyes are fucked. I just can't anymore. So yeah.
I think that you're definitely spot on regarding the picking up the rules for games in online in comparison to doing it face to face. There's small things like you can look at decks and see how many cards are left easily.
Yeah, exactly.
Often online, it's harder to see. If you take a game like Pain Farm Agricola, it's really easy to play.
Stop calling it Pain Farm. I object.
It is Pain Farm. Or Misery Farm. Misery Farm. That works too.
Misery Farm will do. Playing that as an app or online is actually smooth. It's a better game.
That's true.
And all of the barriers to access are largely gone, and you can only choose from the very small select number of things that are directly in front of you on screen, and it makes it very clear what they are. But when you're viewing it and setting it all up as well for playing a proper game of Pain Farm with everyone, the amount of time it takes for everyone to take their turns, the amount of options sitting in front of you are often overwhelming. So the barrier there is actually easier rather than harder for some games. But if you've already played it literally physically, it suddenly becomes very smooth in comparison, because you just don't need to reset it up every time at the very least. So yeah, I'd say there's upsides and downsides there.
James, so you're not.
I mean, Carcassonne
come up on your podcast?
No, because we deal with role-playing games. We don't talk about board games. But I've played a lot of Carcassonne online.
Your book, like any chats you'd had about your book.
Oh, that, yeah. To an extent. And did while I was, because, like Andy, I had COVID at the start of the whole thing, and had also just started a new job with Asmodee. I didn't have long COVID in the same way. It has not affected me physically, but it has really affected me mentally. My focus and memory are a fraction of where they were before. Fairly large fraction, but still a fraction. And this is slightly a side point, but I've talked to a lot of NHS people about this, and they go, well, there's no real scale for measuring this. And they do have. There's a 3-hour physical pencil paper test that you can do with the NHS, spatial awareness, spatial word reasoning, memory lists and stuff like that. And you go through that. I did all of that. And the specialist consultant looked at me and said, well, the one thing we can tell from this is you're very good at games. And it's like, well, yes, yes, I kind of said that coming in. But the Board Game Geek actually measures games in terms of their complexity. They have a numerical rating. It is voted on by players. There's no objective clarity to it, but it's better than nothing. And I've been able to go into specialists and go, look, there is a scale. Because before this, I was round about a 3.4 on Board Game Geek, I was less comfortable. And I now feel that kind of less comfortableness about a 2.7 on a hardness. So I have a numerical rating for how much my ability to hold a game in my head has dropped. And, this appears to be fairly constant. It didn't drop immediately. It was kind of a slow decline, and it now seems to have plateaued. On the other hand, I had COVID again last week. So who knows? But as part of being employed by Asmodee, which I was, the reason I'm not with Asmodee anymore is because I couldn't do the job anymore, because my brain is no longer, I've lost the focus that I needed to do that. But we got free membership of Board Game Arena, which Asmodee had just acquired at the time. So I got to play a whole bunch of titles on that. And it's kind of similar but different. Carcassonne in particular, I've actually played the Carcassonne app a lot. And it's like Carcassonne, but there's certain things it does much better, like calculating the farms on the fly. At any point in the game, you can just go, show me what farms are in play. Bang! And they're all there. And they're right. They're accurate. And the other things, it will show you not only how many tiles are left, but which tiles are still unplayed.
Yeah.
And that's a massive difference. That changes the way you play the game. I think I prefer playing it face to face. I like the tactility. I like looking at people's faces. I like the trash talk. The app is very good. It is a different game. But in terms of role playing, because I played 3 main campaigns during COVID, I'm aware I'm playing catch up here because I'd lost about 7 or 8 minutes due to rubbish Wi-Fi. I played a game of D&D with my kids and some of their friends and some of my friends over the internet. We were all within walking distance of each other. We could have played face-to-face, but it was COVID. That was great. That went really well. I played a bunch of Lady Blackbird, which we stretched out into a campaign with a bunch of academics up and down the UK. That was great. That was really, really fun. I felt we really got the most out of Lady Blackbird that way. And then I played a bunch of another D&D, some Ravenloft, using Roll20, and it was horrible. Because having Roll20 and the maps there and the little characters turned it into a board game. Yeah. And we lost the atmosphere of Ravenloft completely, because at all points you can see how, exactly where you are and exactly where everyone else is and how many zombies there are. And there's no tone, there's no atmosphere. And this is a DM I know well, I've played with before, I respect his ability, but Roll20 for him was a handicap rather than an enabler. Great for dice rolling, but in terms of everything else. And I would not go back to it. A lot of the games I play are on the kind of experimental end. They are not dice driven. A lot of them are card driven. I'm working on a thing with a draw bag mechanic at the moment. I do a bunch of play testing too. Yes, I could program that in Tabletop Simulator. I think I'm not a programmer. I didn't go into IT for a reason. If I can get around the table with a bunch of mates, I absolutely will, because I want the tactility, I want the face-to-face experience, I want the immediacy. I don't want the playtest notes being, well, the technology wasn't working or wasn't up to scratch. I want to know how the game is working, and you only really get that across a table. Having said that, as I said, I had COVID again last week. COVID has not gone away. This variant that's going around at the moment is nasty. It put me down for a week. It's 3 days of which I did not have the mental capacity to write an email. It was genuinely, I was basically vacant. So do take care. Do not go into crowded situations without being aware that there are potential health risks. And the problem with games is you're sitting around a table in fairly close proximity with people, quite often in a small room. You are breathing the same air as them for 3 or 4 hours for role playing generally. Yeah. That can be a problem.
I just like to everyone. Go, Andy.
Well, I have a very, very specific memory relating to that, and it was the last time in our old Enemy Within campaign that we were playing before lockdown. It was the last time we played a session before the lockdown, and then Andy got ill and everything else. And it was at the point where people were beginning to talk about it, and there was chat in the education world about what's going to happen. I think Italy had maybe gone into lockdown by that point.
Just hit lockdown.
And we were like, right, it's maybe going to happen. And I was like, oh my God, I have to train 400 people how to use Teams who've never used it before, and all that kind of stuff. And we were sitting around, and then like on one side of the table, I think it was me and Magnus, and like, or no, I mean he was on the other side, but certainly that we were all, as you do, a big part of role playing in person certainly used to be the bringing in communal eating of snacks. That was a big thing, and everybody had their crisps and stuff, which is fine. And then there was like, some of the people in our group had brought like salsa, and there was like people from 2 different households dipping in the same salsa. And I think it was me and Magnus, it was certainly me and somebody were sat on the other side being like, yeah, no, I'm actually not okay with that. And I had like, it was the first time I'd ever had such a visceral self-preservation instinct with something as seemingly benign as salsa. But
to bring back one small comment that James brought up, which I think was particularly pertinent on playtesting, I found that playtesting online is very difficult to determine the enjoyability of a game. How much it works at the table, the individual narratives that may be spun by the coolness that are brought to the table by perhaps the mechanics or the individual cards and the stories they tell or anything similar. Very difficult to do that online, but by comparison, online worked really well for figuring out maths, figuring out where the probabilities were lying, figuring out which parts were working in terms of the regularity of certain events occurring or something similar, depending on the game that you're playing. So it worked really well for maths, worked really well for breaking down the mechanics, but I found it very difficult to determine the actual enjoyability of a game and how players will interact at a table, whether it's the sort of game where they snidely look at each other and go, which you don't get when you're online very much at all. You're just like, oh yeah, I've got a good card now. Or alternatively, games where they're looking at each other and you can see that they're gauging things and the tone of the play changes as everybody starts thinking. Conversation begins to dip. That again speaks to the enjoyability of how the game will be played at the table. Something that it feels like is almost always the case when you're playing online, when the banter drops. I mean, it's not gone. It's just in a different fashion, but the banter does drop.
Yeah.
I found it very different.
Yeah, I found that with our gaming group when we were trying to do stuff with I think Tabletopia, and we had a player who when you play face to face, occasionally they would sort of interest would wane or attention and focus would wane, and when you're around the table, you can engage with that and bring them back in. But we're playing on Tabletopia, and the first any of us knew was this. You clearly had been watching YouTube clips off to the side because some noisy event happened on a YouTube clip. We all went, "What the hell was that?" He said, and you realize, oh, he's just like zoned out, and it has been zoned out for the past 20 minutes. But because everybody has their turn, and if it's not your turn, you're not really engaged with the rest of the group around the table. It's that stuff like that became quite a challenge.
I've seen a lot of GMs complaining about that in online role playing as well. That if it's not on camera, then people are doing other things while they're playing, and some people can manage that, but a lot of people can't. And,
yeah, totally.
I've got a comment here from Eyeless Deceiver, and it's quite long, but I want to read it out because I don't want to extract bits that I might think are important. I'll read out the whole thing. So I'm currently 2 years and 7 months into long COVID. I was starting to improve last year in the summer, had another infection and relapsed. By the end of last year, I was in a deep depression, and it took me until about 2 months ago to surface from it. So I'm getting better these days and definitely acknowledge that, as I should. However, my ongoing symptoms are such that I struggle with anything approaching a daily life, let alone trying to prepare something or finishing a map or location writing when I have the creativity. I also have chronic fatigue syndrome, which combines wonderfully with long COVID. Yeah, we know a couple of people in that situation, and it is awful. So Eyeless Deceiver says, I've been struggling to restart my game, though it now seems to be coming together. 2 of my friends, players, unfortunately cannot play anymore due to life and its circumstance. Truth be told, the Rookery and Lawhammer are a big inspiration for me, especially knowing that COVID impacted you as well, Andy.
Thanks very much, Eyeless Deceiver. Because when I take off my gaming hat and my happy presenting face, I'm fucked up, man. I'm not in a very good place, and I don't often discuss this online because, as you say, it's a difficult thing to discuss and it's not something that we generally do. But my body is a mess in comparison to what it used to be. I still can't walk for more than a mile without being utterly exhausted. Doing any job at all involves me having to effectively almost put a mask on to actually engage with it and almost pretend to be the person who can do the job, but doing that involves such an investment of energy that come the end of it, I'm absolutely knackered in a way that I never was previously. I would be able to sit, and I know this is not healthy, but I could sit down, work for 20 hours, have a quick nap, get back up again, work for another 20 and not feel it. That's the sort of worker that I was. I would just go and go and go and go and go. And there's still a part of me that does that. And it still happens, but it's now a rarity. Now I have to actually really make a step. And when I do that, it tends to come at a cost. I'm not in the place that I was before. And to conclude on all this, Lawhammer has been for me, in terms of, for those of you who don't know, I stream every Friday as the GM on an online game, role-playing every week. And that for me has been a massive boost because it's a regular thing that requires me to put on that face. And I have decided beforehand that as long as I'm not infectious, I am going to press ahead regardless of how I feel. And I cannot express to you how ill I have been some weeks. Some weeks I've not just been ill, I've been on massive painkillers in absolute agony. But overcoming that and allowing that to be the benchmark that I can do has made the rest of the things that I need to sit down and do almost easy by comparison. Still difficult, still an actual process that I have to go through, but definitely doable. And I think that in terms of the overall conversation here, COVID has made a massive impact on my ability to engage with games in general and my ability to engage with my job as well. It has not made me less capable in terms of the actual doing the thing, but it has changed how I approach it to ensure that I can do it. And it has been difficult. There was, as several people here know, I vanished for about 7 months with nothing but the most infrequent of communication. I was that ill, and I've caught COVID another 4 times since then, which is enormously impressive for someone who barely leaves his house. It's like, how did this happen? It's almost starting to happen again.
It's the plague bearers. It's the three of us who are the plague bearers. We bring it home.
Yeah. If you've got kids, schools are a petri dish, basically.
Yeah,
I know.
Mark, we sort of started the Rookery, didn't we, around about the start of COVID, and that was interesting.
Yeah, that was clever.
Because I went from clever of us, but we could not have foreseen what was coming. But we went from, I don't know, I felt that we got to know each other really well in a way that it probably would have been completely different if there'd been no COVID and you hadn't been in lockdown and we hadn't been in lockdown. And
yes, the adversity, the shared adversity certainly forged strong bonds between teammates, I think, for sure, despite the fact that we're 5,000 miles apart,
Yeah.
I mean, not to make light of what Andy just said, which is very kind of, I have to remind myself of that because sometimes I'll be pinging Andy or pinging Lindsay. Has Andy read that yet? He hasn't got back to me. And I have to remind myself of what he's gone through. But also, I have to say that what I found incredible with many of your Lawhammer streams is to learn subsequently that what you're going through, because some of your best performances as a GM have been when you're absolutely messed up. So I want to just applaud you for
thanks for that, Mark.
Being through that.
Amusingly, I want to call out one point because Mark called out something. It was a while back now, a good month and a half, and he's like, "Oh, this one was amazing." I had no recollection of it. I was on so many painkillers. I had no recollection at all. And I was like, "Really?" I had to go and watch it afterwards, and I was like, "Oh, that was a thing that happened."
But I think like the serious point for adults is that we're all of a similar, around about the same generation. Like neurodiversity wasn't really particularly understood when we were growing up. And I think some people like you, Andy, during COVID started to realize more and more through a sequence of events about your own neurodiversity. And actually it's kind of because you have had to have those coping mechanisms and mask so heavily for the last 40 years of your life or more, that actually I think you do make such a good GM. But like, wouldn't wish that upon anyone. But certainly for us, for me, there were things that, not to go into details because it's their story, but when schools went online and I had 2 young people in the house with me, I suddenly saw what their coping techniques and the things they were doing to get through the school day that fell apart because they didn't have friends around them, they didn't have those things around them, that really brought home to me the neurodiversity in our family. And I just think if it hadn't been for COVID, I would never have seen that, and what impact that then would have had on their longer term mental health in the way that it's had on me, Lindsay's. So it's COVID was awful for us, but at the same time, things that came out of it that have been so like life changing for us as a family. And I think a lot of people with hidden neurodiversity had found that.
Yeah, I'd like to make a clear example of that. I was 1 week so ill, I could barely stand. My mind was everywhere. And the way I coped with it was making the entire session be someone else. So I stopped being the GM and I brought in somebody else to be the GM who was one of the NPCs, and they played a game within the game. So I was no longer being me at all. I had a face to put on, a literal mask, and that made it for me not just doable, it made it something that actually occurred. I was at that point in absolute agony. I couldn't sit down. I was in so much pain because I was going through another issue because thanks COVID, it's ruined my body. Fortunately now resolved. But I think that also speaks to the very nature of masks and how they are used under certain circumstances, and how for someone who has now realized some significant and deep neurodiversity, I was used to using masks to do that. And I was already in a place where I could don a thing, use that, and then at the end of it, take that off and just collapse in a corner somewhere and try to get to sleep. It's a very odd mindset. I'm fully aware of it. I'm going to stop now.
I haven't really been doing very well at getting through the questions in the same way that I would if they were in the in the Discord banner. So here's one from Elle. Had COVID impacted the core elements you need for a game, such as online materials and maps? And has this in turn changed how you see and use buildables, battle maps, and miniatures?
I'll jump in with a yes and yes. The amount of people who are playing online now is significant. And regardless of whether it's my personal preference or not, makes very little difference at all to the sort of material that we need to create to ensure that we're providing people out there with the things that they need. And where beforehand, a map was a useful aid de memoire, perhaps, for exactly where everything is and understanding the spatial relationships between one thing and another, and possibly also a really handy way of really ensuring that the setting is ground in with that map, because it's something we referred to multiple times. So you want to make sure that it matches the game that it's representing. Nowadays, those maps will be used and they will be brought up on screen, and people will be moving little tokens around on them, which means all of your NPCs, it's good to have tokens for them. All of your maps, you want to make sure that if you haven't got a high-res version, it's got enough detail in the text so that people can go off and use their own map software to reproduce that. And that's something that people do nowadays much more than they used to do before, because if it's not presented within the product at hand, they will make what they need.
Yeah, I had to, when I made the digital version of Dark Deeds, I absolutely had to include additional components that you don't need in the physical game, because you're not all sat around a table. You can't. There's not that sort of social understanding. You don't have that relationship with the players in the same room. So there's I wouldn't say opportunity for cheating, but certainly for misunderstanding of where you were in the game individually, or where you placed your token or where your character was meant to be at a certain point. So you had to create additional spots and a little pawn to move up and down the board, so just everybody could understand on their turn where everybody else happened to be in relation to one another. So yeah, you certainly find yourself having to do a little bit of extra work to account for that disconnect.
Sorry, was someone going to jump in there? I'll
got
just read
anything
out
that you'd
this
add
one
to
from
that,
John
James?
Pitt.
Actually, no, sorry. My mind just went blank, which it does from time to time these days. I can't even remember what the question was.
It's fine. I've got a few comments to read out. So John Pick says, strangely enough, we started our Wifrip campaign online just before COVID started due to living in multiple countries. It made moving our local D&D game online much easier to organise, as I was already getting used to gaming that way. Here's one from Seagoat about online gaming conventions. Finding it personally difficult to find the time or finances to attend gaming conventions in person, I thought this was something out of my reach. Thankfully, the RPG took up the mantle and moved most of their conventions online. I attended several gaming conventions online over COVID, playing with a variety of players around the world in a variety of games and systems I wouldn't get the chance to play back in my local gaming group. And Killer Chandra,
can I just make a quick point on that? The advent of online conventions made a massive difference to a variety of indie games that would otherwise, particularly during COVID, have just vanished, because it dragged a lot of people together into an online space where they had an opportunity again to present themselves. And if it had been a standard convention, they would have been limited by the numbers that walked through the doors, which may have been for a smaller con, a few hundred up to a few thousand, depending on the nature of the con at hand. But with some of the online cons that were organized during COVID and at the end tail of COVID, they were often pulling in numbers that were significantly larger, and gathering people to their games that would never have been played beforehand. So I think that they were absolutely marvelous. Not necessarily my cup of tea, but certainly something worthwhile doing. I found it also particularly fascinating over on the computer game side, because they attempted to do the same thing, but they did it in a different way because they are naturally computer game players. So you'll often find that instead of just going, here's a big Discord, everybody turn up, there's a bunch of games you can go to, here's some convention talks where we're going to be discussing a subject or another, you can go join those channels and watch somebody. They actually built online playgrounds that you could wander around with avatars. And the idea behind it was absolutely marvelous, because you got that sense of wandering into a convention and it almost felt like you're back in the 1990s in various bizarre online chat rooms where you had little avatars that walked around and little speech bubbles sticking out of them, because they sort of felt like that, but reimagined for what was then the early 20s. But they completely failed. They just were not as engaging, because they tried to recreate a convention space rather than trying to build something that was at heart for people to engage with awesome. And it was all about building up this idea of, we'll make a convention online and make it digitally. I was involved with helping one group of people who were building Solasta, a D&D game. And their whole setup was, from the outside looking in, utterly crazy. They had to go by what the convention offered, so it wasn't their setup per se, but little avatars, and you could buy little special heads that you could put on them to make it look like it was for one game or another. It was all about monetization, not really about connecting with your customers, and it sort of failed. And it was interesting to see the difference between the online options that were offered by people basically like us, who were just going, how can we make this work, because we have no idea, and people who had the technical know-how to make it work and just got caught up in the minutiae.
Yeah, I saw a bunch of them. I mean, there were some 2D ones, there were some 3D ones. There was a Southeast Asian one that I think used a commercial tool that looked like a 90s JRPG. And that got some really good response, because it was it felt like you were within a game space. Mm-hmm. But the 3D ones, and Asmodee did one as a sales tool. I mean, it was for retailers, it was a trade thing rather than a consumer-facing thing. But Asmodee is not short of a shilling, and threw some technical know-how at this, and it was just utterly, for me at least, lacking in atmosphere. It showed you what the product looked like, but there was no sense of being there. There was no sense of what makes games interesting in any way. But then you go around the London Toy Fair, and it's very much like that. It's okay, so this is what the box looks like. What's inside? We don't care. What's the retail price? We care about that. I think for the trade customers, perhaps it did work more, but for the consumer space, you're absolutely right. And they didn't play to the strengths of digital. They tried to recreate the analog, the real world space. And that was I can understand why, but I didn't enjoy any of the online conventions I went to.
I imagine it was like movies in the 80s when they show you computer programs, and they have to do this blocky, shitty 3D. Like, let's crack the code here, and they have to go, oh fuck, how are we going to
pretty much every attempt to picture cyberspace in a movie or a TV series.
Yeah.
But I will, just to reiterate, the various conventions that I saw, Chaos Team did a couple that I was aware of, and there's a few other just smaller key digital versions of what would normally have been face-to-face conventions in the roleplay environment. Most of those were actually pretty decent. They did a damn good job. They were often quite small, but the people who were engaged with them were trying out new games, meeting new people, and often not just from the locality that they were from, which is generally the case, obviously, for a standard face-to-face convention, but from people around the world. So it made it a far more international and far more open event, and that was kind of cool.
We've got a follow-up question from Eleanor, but first I'm going to read out Bastian's comment on the questions for Rooks. So the Darkest House from Monty Cook Games was released during COVID, and it was made specifically to be played online. I managed to run some friends through a few rooms before reality butted in, and it was great. Created a completely different atmosphere than traditional tabletop. It definitely changed my view on playing over the interwebs. The COVID was a boon for the people who make VTTs too, I reckon. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So Eleanor is following up on the question that I read out before. So if I can follow on, when designing and making games, do you think in person first and then online?
I tend to, if we're just talking personally, I tend to think of how I engage with it first and what makes it super fun for myself. And that generally starts with what's going to work for me. And that is almost always, in my case, face-to-face, because that's how I prefer to play. But you always have to be aware to put on a different hat, or if we're speaking earlier in the conversation, a different mask, and ensure that you do try to accommodate all types of play, and not just accommodate, but also try to make those the best possible experiences they can, which does mean going out there and giving it a go yourself, so you're not just falling behind with information that's maybe a year or two old, particularly with such a fast and evolving playground. Sorry, James, do you want to go jump in now?
Yeah. Sorry, it's whether it's my memory blanking out or my Wi-Fi blanking out. This has not been a good stream for me. I think of myself as a tabletop designer primarily, but I think actually I kind of design in a conceptual space, because I think in a kind of a melange of themes and mechanics and stuff like that. And I think about how mechanics are going to interlock and how people are going to interlock with the mechanics. And then I think about, well, what's the best forum for that? And sometimes I've come up with a game and it's good. Okay, that's tabletop, that's online, could be both, that could be a melange of the two. But yeah, and then there are sometimes I have a crashing, thuddy realization that what I've designed is a system that could only work on tabletop because of a particular physical aspect of it. I'm thinking a lot about cards at the moment, and a game I'm working on at the moment. I'm really pleased with this. I won't give you the full details, but every character draws. The first mechanic I had was every character draws a card at the start. There are only 3 players, but there are 4 cards, one of each of the suits. And it's about being a member of a resistance group. If you draw the heart, there is only one. You joined it for emotional reasons. If you draw the diamond, you joined it for monetary reasons. If you joined it for if you draw the club, you are an agent from a foreign power sent into aid. And if you draw the spade, you are a traitor, and your purpose in being involved is to betray the others, but not necessarily this session. And then it's like, okay, well, but I've got this deck of cards now. Oh, so you draw a card, you look at your card, and then they all go back in the deck, and the deck is shuffled. So the only person who knows what you drew is you. Then you've got this deck of cards. It's what do you do with that? And I thought, oh, well, okay, it's a resistance group. It's kind of ersatz making tools. The street finds its own uses for things. The deck of cards becomes your Rolodex. When you meet an NPC, you choose a card that represents them with the symbols meaning the same things, and you write your NPC description on that in a kind of almost memento way. Like the tattoos. It's kind of so you can add stuff later on. That's not gonna work digitally. Yes, you could make a note. 5 of diamonds. No, I want people to write physically in handwriting on the card, so that you look at a card and it's got 2 or 3 different handwritings on. You go, whose handwriting is that? Telling us we can't trust this person. I love it as a mechanic, and it seems to work really well. Only play tested once, but you know, that's I would love to come up with a way to make that digitally. I simply don't think it's going to. That's a mechanic that's going to be stronger on the tabletop. You know, sometimes you come up with that, and rather than trying to think of a way to divert my energies to do that, do a digital version of that, I'm going to create the tabletop version, see if it works as well as it is. Like I said, one playtest session worked quite well, still needs to ferment a little while longer. But at that point, I'll sit down and think, okay, how can I take the ideas that are really strong in this and possibly translate it for a digital version?
Yeah. You know, when I was playing Cartographers, which is in the physical game, every player is drawing, adding to a map and building up, and actually, you know, physically draw your mountains and your cities and rivers. And then the digital version, which is the version I played first, it's tiles, and you have slots to drop the tiles in, which it removes a lot of that the sort of the lovely tactile nature of becoming your own cartographer, but actually breaks it all down into a little more manageable, practical sense for you know, playing online. So yeah, I don't know how. I'm not sure if that's an option. I don't know how you would potentially translate that and replace the handwriting with you know, with a selection of tiles. I'm not sure. Again, you limit the scope, and you limit, you lose the nuance, but perhaps you come up with something still you know, more practical for online play. I don't know.
It's like Among Us, isn't it? And the difference between that and like a game like Werewolf, where Among Us, you're doing stuff and then you sort of convene and then you go and do stuff again. And that works online, but that wouldn't work. Like it has to be online, and it has to be on the screen, and you're seeing the stuff on the screen. Whereas the other ones kind of have to be not online, because you're having to gauge people's physical. I'm terrible at those, by the way. I've got like the worst poker face, and I constantly like guessed people wrong. I'm just so bad at them. So I like something like Among Us, because I like my weaknesses are not apparent.
I'd just like to bring up Seagoat's comment there about losing nuance when moving from tabletop RPG to online RPG. That can be the case, but isn't always the case. It does depend upon the nature of the game that's being played, because some games work very well inside the online space, depending upon how the mechanics themselves are presented and how those mechanics frame the stories and narratives that are built. Some mechanics work very well as an online set of tools. Some of them are clearly designed to create a social connection between everyone using those rules as the frameworks, and that requires people being face to face. Games that are designed for online play will often work significantly better online than they ever could, for example, face to face, because they'll be using those extra tools that online play allows. So I wouldn't say that's necessarily the case, but I would say that it is often the case, because so many TTRPGs are written solely for the tabletop. And because of that, because they are so focused on that, the translation then towards the online space is a translation. It's not been designed for that. So you are always going to lose something. And often because it's been designed for one space and they don't try to make it fit the other space, they just try to make it work. It's not about using the tools that you get on the other side in a creative fashion. They do then lose something in translation. But I don't think that has to be the case.
It's interesting that there are very few. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Let me just. I'll jump in very quickly, and then you can come back if that's okay. There's very few RPGs that are designed for the digital space, because there are certain things that digital does so much better. You only have to look at a CRPG to see how well they handle initiative compared to the way TTRPGs handle initiative, which in almost all cases is a kludge. And doesn't feel like a real, like real combat. The other thing that computer games or computer interfaces for role-playing games can do is back channeling, secret messages. If you pass a message across a tabletop, it is very obvious that's what you're doing. But separate text channels and chat channels for a game that is strong on that kind of thing, passing notes to the DM may not have time to respond, but knows what's going on, knows what you're plotting. You can be talking to other players at the same time. And if you've got this thing that a number that Sassy Pancakes mentions there, that only one player is talking at a time, the other players can be doing stuff. They can be talking. They're just not doing it out loud to the entire group. And that's a fantastic strength. And I've yet to see, I'm not saying there's no one out there, but I've yet to see a game that is specifically designed for that.
I mean, I would say in our little online game that we had tried that didn't last very long, there was a degree of that, but it didn't work really well because it was really fucking obvious whenever anybody was typing anything, because we all have such bad poker faces. We'd all be like, ha, 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 ha. And it was like, what's Andy plotting? I'm like, wait, what? No, nothing. I'm not plotting anything.
Yeah.
Or Andy would send us
that noisy mechanical keyboards will give you away every time.
Yeah. It's interesting, James, just because Sassy Pancakes is saying that, you know, they can't talk, but what you're saying is there are ways online that you can't do that. But for us in our streamed game, this exact issue rises, that we can't have people over talking each other. So there are a lot of asides that we usually would have done and had to stop ourselves doing, and sometimes it creeps up again and we have to like rein ourselves in, because the temptation to turn to the person sitting next to you to make a snide comment is, for me, almost overwhelming.
Ed and I are getting very good at doing it just with our eyes. I don't know if you've noticed that. We've got like an eye-based kind of code going on. Yeah. like a fan dance.
Yeah, I was going to say paranoia. Like, so the one that jumps to mind is paranoia. That is the kind of game that you would want an online system to work really well for doing. And Svanuri says paranoia online is ridiculously good for that.
Yeah. When we were rebooting Paranoia, which is the previous edition, I believe the new edition is literally just out pretty much today. We did the previous edition, myself and Grant Howitt and Paul Dean. And we wanted to build digital stuff into it, but we knew we were handicapped because Mongoose had asked us to put in a card-based combat system. And that's really hard to do digitally. That requires proper investment to develop the software or work within an existing tabletop. We didn't have the time, we didn't have the budget to do that. So we just focused on the tabletop, the face-to-face experience. But yeah, Paranoia demands that level of back channeling.
I think Paranoia
and subterfuge.
Yeah, I think Paranoia would be one of those games that really would benefit from a very strong online edition being made, because the entirety of Paranoia, even with the computer being your friend, oh my goodness, you could really use that just as an underpinning part of the mechanical process of how people are communicating, because a lot of things could be working through the computer as you're dealing with things online. I mean, just the idea starts exciting me for how you could make that work as a set of mechanics. I think there's a lot in there. So yes.
I think Andy, I think we're losing you. There's something wrong with your microphone, but we do actually only have 2 minutes left anyway.
How's that? Has that made a difference?
I don't know.
Just beat the technology. It always works.
Yeah,
chastise the technology. They didn't know its place.
Says, as yours, yeah, we appreciate the absence of over talking in live streams. I think over talking, yeah, especially if we turn them into podcasts. Sassy Pancake says it depends on the group as well. An RPG designed for that, as in the back channels that you're talking about, James, would be really interesting. Excellent. Well, that is us almost to the end of the stream. Yeah, like, get on it, James. So, just one final question. After having experienced loads of different ways to play games, what is each of the panel's favourite way? In person, online, in their own heads? Tell us.
I'll go first since bang, 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 my mic works. Right, so for me, as I think will probably be obvious from the course of this particular stream, I prefer face-to-face. I just enjoy that group mechanic, although it has to be said, still to this day, my best role-playing experience was both face-to-face and at a con with an audience of around about 100, 150 or so all gathered round, because that created not just a really good dynamic at the table where it was a very entertaining game, but that audience influence upon how everybody reacted at the table really brought everything up to an extra level, because there was that performative play that you get with doing online games, plus about 10 with everybody all around laughing at a particular thing that was funny, or going ooh at a particular betrayal. So if I'm to be honest with myself, and as much as I hate this, because I really do not like doing this sort of thing, my favorite game ever was a performative one in front of a large crowd. But in terms of just playing myself, face to face.
Yep. Mark, are you a physical or a virtual?
Favorite way to experience gaming? Choose your own adventure book sat on the toilet. Yeah, you asked.
Brilliant.
That's
So
going to make that's
lot of
logistically hard though, because I'm assuming you play it like I do, where you put your fingers in all the other pages so you can go back and redo your changes. If you
I'm gonna you can paint whatever picture in your head of me doing that. You need to.
What happens if you
mind
drop
boggles.
the dice? It doesn't bear thinking about.
Again, all part of the thrill.
Fingers in everywhere, dropping dice. This is the worst.
Yeah, definitely. I love it.
Moving on, Andy Lee.
Yeah, definitely in person. Yeah, and I think not being able to do it for like a year, like reinforced to me how important a part of my kind of like routine for sort of mental well-being and stuff it is. So yeah, 100% in person.
Yeah. Preferably cat-free though, right?
Preferably cat-free. Yeah, if my forever GM and good friends who hosted the game like didn't buy a cat during lockdown, it would have been even better. But them's the breaks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And James?
Yeah, face to face. 2 reasons. Physically rolling dice is just such an important part of the gaming experience. The tactility of it all. Yes, I've got my metal dice right in front of me here, just for casual rolls during it. And the other thing is, you can't share snacks online.
Yeah.
It's
I'm never sharing snacks again. I'm telling you, COVID scarred me. That's it. This is my dip. It's for me. My salsa.
That's an excuse, though. Surely. No, I brought the good 100%. Guacamole.
Yeah, I noticed none of us have said LARPing. That's from another era for us.
Oh,
yeah.
At least that's outdoors, I suppose.
Exactly.
Some of it.
Yeah.
Well, that's us. We've reached the end of our hour. Thank you so much for joining me, Mark and Andy and James. It's great to see you again, James, for the start of this season, and always a pleasure to be joined by my fellow Rooks for a chat. We will see you all next week, but until then, goodbye. All that remains for me to say is good night and caw-caw. See you soon.
Ta-ra.